We love our connection to our listeners here at the Herle Burly, and the fact that you come here for a couple of hours every week for conversations about things like Scott's hair and Jenni's early morning fishing triumphs on Sturgeon Lake continues to both shock and delight us. But listen to this incredible story from our presenting sponsor, TELUS, about connecting on a deeper and more critical level. Eden Valley, Alberta is known for its sweeping landscape. Gorgeous. But when it comes to wireless connection, all those hills and valleys act as natural interruptions to signals. When COVID hit, recognizing the critical need for communication between Bearspaw First Nation and Alberta Health Services, the province reached out to TELUS for help. TELUS quickly developed a cell site on wheels. They call it a cow, typically used for one-off temporary occasions. And it enabled immediate communications with public health officials. Community leaders were quick to take action, working with Alberta Health Services to limit the spread of the virus. Members who'd been infected went into isolation, and supports were put into place for the families as they recovered. Bearspaw Chief Darcy Dixon praised his community for the speed and success of the effort. Key to that mission was the reliability of the communication between residents and public health officials. As part of its commitment to bridging the digital divide, TELUS is collaborating with Indigenous governments, the federal and provincial governments, and third-party organizations to expand its world-leading wireless LTE and broadband networks. They've also reallocated close to $10 million worth of wireless build activities in Alberta to make sure networks keep up with the unprecedented demand in the wake of COVID-19. To learn more, visit connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, Herle Burlyites, thanks for coming back to the pod. So happy to have you here. We've got another two-parter for you today, chock full of insightful political talk, dire economic predictions, sprinkled with some creative swears and references to statues you don't know whether to tear down and throw in the river or hug. First up on the podcast, Phil Fontaine. Phil is a former three-term National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Beside being a leading voice for human rights and a survivor of residential school abuse himself, he negotiated the residential school settlement agreement, $5.6 billion in individual compensation, the largest settlement in Canadian history, for the largest human rights violation in Canadian history. I've got history with Phil from his work at the center of the Kelowna Accord. We're going to talk about systemic racism in this country and how we work to change that. After Phil, we've got our political panel, the ever-articulate, ever-passionate, ever-secretive about her birthday yesterday, Jenni Byrne, and Scott Reid, who will be joining us in progress today. Happy birthday to you, Jenni. We'll pick up on the conversation with Phil, plus we'll discuss the economic snapshot coming down from Mount Morneau about 24 hours after we record this. Is an economic snapshot really just a fiscal update in Polaroid form? And how bad is our economy really going to be 6 months from now? We'll chat about the hate boycott of Facebook, cancel culture, and the tearing down of statues. Where does it start? Where does it end? And which statues deserve to have another statue of an asterisk placed beside them? A bunch of other stuff too. Oh, and let's not forget Kanye West for president. Phil Fontaine, I want to warmly welcome you to the Herle Burly. Thank you for joining us. I am honored that you are here.
I'm honored to be here, David. Good morning, and I look forward to an interesting conversation this morning.
Yeah, me too. So, ever since we've been in COVID and in a lockdown and during the pandemic, I've been asking my guests just to start off with, how are you doing? It's been 4 months now of lockdown, relatively, although you're in the West, so it's a little bit looser. How are you doing? How have you been holding up through this period?
We've been holding up, Kathleen and I, we've been holding up pretty fair. We have managed to travel to Nelson, British Columbia now twice. This week, we're headed back there, and hopefully we'll stay the rest of the summer, other than the appointments here in Calgary that I can't miss from time to time. And the reason I'm in Calgary today and tomorrow is one here, the show, and the other is an appointment. So it's been good, David. I can't complain, really.
What's life like in Nelson, BC?
Oh, paradise. It's an absolutely wonderful place. No COVID cases. And I think that the town allows through the health authorities, gatherings of 50 people with social distancing. Not all, but many of the establishments are open, but they follow strict guidelines: social distancing, sanitizing hands, wiping carts, and for example, you go into the source. You don't go into the source until the people there have in fact interviewed you, and then they take you in and stand inside a box, and you can't really communicate face to face with the salespeople. They yell out the product, but it's been impressive.
You have to really want to get into the source.
That's right. Absolutely. That's right. And
so,
go ahead.
Yeah. No, you tell me more.
No. Everything is good here. It's no COVID cases in Nelson. So
it's amazing. BC's been such a shining example.
Yeah. So it's been we regard it as a safe haven. So there you are.
Yeah.
There you are.
And a beautiful safe haven it is. I was looking you up, and we have something in common, Phil, in that you have 14 honorary law degrees. You have been awarded an honorary law degree from 14 universities.
18.
14, I think. How many is it?
18.
18. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I have one. It's from the University of Saskatchewan. It's also an honorary degree. I paid for it, but I think everybody involved, my teachers and everybody would agree it's an honorary degree. It's not intended to be used for the actual practice of law. So you and I have honorary law degrees in common. Neither one of us should probably hang up a shingle and give anybody any legal advice.
I haven't considered that. I think it's the institutions have been pretty kind and generous. Yeah, it's something.
Well, not really generous, because you're one of. I've known you for a long time. We've worked together. You're one of the great people of this country. You are somebody who has, with an open heart and compassion and empathy for others, led the fight for Indigenous opportunity and First Nations rights and equality in this country. So it's amazing. Your story is fundamental to that. And, it's 5:30 in the morning where you are, and by God, you've probably told this story a million times. But I'd like people to hear it to the extent that you can tell it to us. How did you end up in a residential school? You went to residential school your whole time. How did you end up in one?
The first residential school I attended was attended by my family, all my older siblings, our mother and father, and uncles. Our grandmother on our father's side attended an industrial school, which preceded residential schools, and it was located in St. Boniface, run by the church. And the industrial schools were modeled, actually, the Canadian experience, were modeled after the industrial schools in the United States, the most famous one being Carlisle in Pennsylvania, where you had the famous Jim Thorpe, US,
the great athlete.
The top athlete in the United States in the first half century. That Pop Warner, right. And then the Pop Warner football. So
yeah,
the industrial schools that were established in Canada were to be as successful, or the authorities hoped they would be as successful as the ones in the States. But these people didn't delve deeply into how these schools were managed and whether students were being treated kindly, generously, and well looked after and ate well. If Jim Thorpe made it out to be as successful as he became, then Carlisle was not a bad school. So St. Boniface became one of the prototypes in Canada. And But parents rose up and complained bitterly that too many of the kids in these schools were dying. So the government reconsidered its position on industrial schools and backed off a bit, and they decided to establish boarding schools, residential schools. So they established one of the 135 odd residential schools in Canada over the life of the experience in Fort Alexander, my reserve, that we know as Sagim, the traditional name now. And as I said, my mom and dad, older siblings, myself and my younger sisters, we all were at the school, and the rules were pretty strict. I mean, we didn't get to see our parents, for example, except for one time a week. On Sundays after church, we had visiting hours with the parents for 2 hours, and they went back home, we went back into the school. And that, for me, probably was the most difficult time during the 7 years I was in Fort Alexander, Indian Residential School, because after grade 7, they moved us to Winnipeg, to the Assiniboia Indian Residential School. They called it Assiniboia High. It is located and operated from the base of the old Veterans Hospital, the Grace, not Grace, but Deer Lodge. They built a new hospital on Portage Avenue. And so government was looking to see what they could make, what use they could make of the school. They set up a residential school. And I attended that one for 3 years. So 10 years. By the time I left residential school after grade 10, I went to a public school. And this was after 10 years of schooling, the very first time I'd been in classrooms with white kids, young men and young women. And the people that ran the schools weren't much different than those that ran Fort Alexander and Winnipeg, except they were a bit more lenient about supervision and the like. One thing they grappled with, and they could never ever wrap their minds around this, is that they had these Indian students from our reserve and a few from the east side that were bused in, and they couldn't get their heads around the fact that we were attending the school and we weren't paying for our education. Government was, and of course they had no idea of the history of the students that they had welcomed into their school. Knew nothing about the history of treaties, the Indian Act, and the pass system that was especially prominent in the western provinces, in particular Saskatchewan, where Indians couldn't leave their reserves without permit. A permit, there was an actual permit that was signed off by the Indian agent. And so that was a bit of the background to my own personal story at the residential school. Did I enjoy the 7 years I spent in Fort Alexander? Sure, there were moments when it was fun. We had hockey, we had football, we had baseball, and the kids there became really very proficient at the three sports, particularly hockey, was a dominant sport, and then baseball. And the school teams were pretty much unbeatable in the region, including whenever they were invited to play in Winnipeg. They were just outstanding, and how good they were, and how successful they were on ice. Kind of missed me one by the time it was my turn to play.
Hey, listen, going back to the residential schools, what do you think your teachers thought of you? What was your relationship with the teachers like? Did they treat you like you were equal people, or did they treat you like you were wards of theirs or something like that? Like, what was the relationship between you and the teachers?
Other than the first night after being brought into the school and entered into the student role. When the teachers and these were nuns, the two that I met were, oh gosh, I thought, oh, they're kind. I'm going to have fun here, and but that attitude and approach quickly went off to the wayside, fell off to the wayside. My mom left. She left me at this place, and I'm not yet 7. And that night, it was a scary place. It was a big, dark place, and Mom and Dad were gone. By that time, our father was ill, and he couldn't come with Mom to drop us off to school. So I spent my very first evening there having soup. My late brother Clem, my late relative Rudy, and of course the nun wanted to know my name. And my first day of school, I was Larry Fontaine, and they knew all about Clem, and the older guys knew about my mom and dad, right? And but I had no idea, absolutely no idea what my experience was going to be like, and sadly, it could have been so much better. It was far worse than I anticipated, and separation from my family and I was a traumatic experience for years, the years I spent there, in one way or another. My parents only lived about 3 miles from the school, and we got to visit. I said every Sunday for 2 hours after High Mass on Sunday, because we went to Low Mass and went to High Mass. So church was very central to our existence there.
Did your mom have to take you there, or did she have any alternative?
Not much of an alternative, because if she had refused, we would have ended up at home, and the principal, the father, would have harassed her to bring me to the school, as happened 1 year when my mom and dad, for whatever happened, or something terrible happened at the school, took all of the kids, my uncle and aunt's son, relatives that lived next door to us, and another set of relatives. They all went to a day school run by the Anglicans. I say the Anglican Church, and so they spent 1 year in day school. It would take them about 10 minutes to walk from home to the school, and it was just like heaven for these young men and girls. But the pressure was on, and it was so great that all of the people that had taken a year off from the residential school went back to the boarding school, and I followed the crowd.
Even with the abuse, help me understand, you were experiencing sexual and physical abuse at this school, and you were going back.
When I became of age, which would be about 8, we were then invited for monthly sessions. All of the boys had to take turn. You'd be a note would be slipped to the teacher of the classroom you might be in, and if it was your name, you were called out, or the nun would come by and hand you the note, go see Father. And so we'd all go see Father, each in turn. And Father would be interested at 8, be quite interested in our sexual life, our thoughts, and actions as you got a little older, and you had to spell these out. And so after the conclusion of this discussion, where all the time you were there, you were absolute, there was an absolute sense of embarrassment and what the hell am I going to tell him this time? And the next procedure was, so you have a clean mind now. Your thoughts, all of the bad thoughts you had, especially about girls, we're going to have to clean your body. And so there was a ritual that we all engaged in, all the guys. And, where you had a little wash. And and this was our genitals, obviously. It wasn't anything above, the upper end of your body. It was your genitals. And when you were done, you left and you went back to the classroom. Everybody knew where you'd been, snickering from the girls quite often. And the girls didn't have all the details around this. And so you can imagine walking into a small room, the basin is there, the towel is there, you eventually know why you're there, and it smells, you can imagine 20, 30, 40 boys during the course of a day. So there's no fresh air, I tell you. And that was the experience. From one aspect of life lived experience in the school, and there's then all kinds of other abuse. Geez, physical, far too much. I witnessed far too much physical abuse. And then the boys, of course, would turn on each other in a very, in ways that were similar to the behavior they witnessed with the authorities. And this was really quite strict in many cases. Of course, you came across some of the nuns that were kinder and more generous than others. And you ended up, as in my case, developing a close attachment to these people. And when I got out of residential school and became very heavy became very involved with my own life, I still do it, David, to this day, go and visit some of these old nuns in St. Boniface, just to connect. And they treat me so well. In fact, when we traveled across the country, I led the delegations to visit with the mother houses of the different orders that have been involved in residential schools. This was part of our, it was a forgiveness tour. It was about reconciliation as we could understand it then. It was still limited, right? And we were always so well received in these mother houses. In some places, they'd sing for us after dinner. In some places, like the Métis nuns in St. Boniface, took out their fiddles and played fiddle tunes for the delegation. And it was always with the greatest of respect that they received us in. And it was really such a fundamental shift in what we knew residential school was like and where these people were at after 60, 70 years. Because in many cases, the nuns, at least psychologically, weren't treated any better than the people they called savage in these schools, because that's what we were either Indians from Fort Alexander, and we had other students from different reserves, especially in the north around Thompson, DePaul, that way. When you were misbehaving, you were called a savage. And so the nuns...
So that too.
Oh, gosh. David, many times. Many times.
So this takes me to a question,
floor.
Phil. You ate food off the floor.
I ate food off the floor. If I was blamed for, and this was more than one occasion, I tell you, this is one of the most humiliating experiences in Fort Alexander. I never had to experience that in Assiniboia. That changed. And they couldn't locate, they couldn't identify who had dropped the food. And I had to, I was forced to eat it in front of my schoolmates. And the nun said, "Okay, boys." By that time, my name had been changed from Larry to Philip, because my name's Larry Philip. And so I was forced to eat food, and it was just the bloody worst thing. And the nun, I remember one time saying, "Okay, let's watch the King." And she would call me the King, because I was the youngest in my family of students at the residential school. Then there were 7 of us yet. My older siblings, as I said, when I entered, I wasn't yet 7, and I suppose I was spoiled to some extent at home. I was the youngest boy, and my older siblings provided me whatever protection they could offer, which was limited, because then they kept the boys, the little guys, on one side of the school. They moved the older guy to another section of the school. So you never got to see your brothers except on Sundays. I mean, you see them during the course of the week, but there's no engagement. There was no
Right.
interaction. And
What
worse,
did these schools and these teachers lead you to believe your options were in life? What did they groom you toward doing in the rest of your life? Did they give you a sense of potential and of optimism about what the outside world could bring you? Did they encourage you to pursue your studies after high school? Any of those kinds of things?
Well, I must admit, David, there wasn't an inspirational moment that I picked up or felt from the 7 years that I spent in the first school. And there was very little talk about what we could become, other than to reference the men that worked in the paper mill that was in the town of Pine Falls, which was adjacent to the reserve. The mill property was located on reserve land that had been surrendered for 99 years, the first round, and sold outright in 26, bought up by this guy by the name of J.D. MacArthur. Built this thing. So they were the most important reference point for us, people that worked in the mill. But we had no idea, of course, what they were, or, we just understood that these were big shots, some of them big shots. And white people, look at them. That's what you ought to think of becoming. There was very little talk about, well, you could be a doctor, you could be a school teacher, you could be a nurse, you could be a priest. That was big in our school, because they established a junior seminary, the St. John's Junior Seminary, and that was destined to produce priests and brothers from our school. So there was a heavy emphasis on becoming part of one of the Catholic orders. In our case, the Oblate Fathers and the Oblate Nuns, and so there was greater emphasis on aspiring to be that, to join that part of the world, rather than ending up in the pulp mill, which a number of our people did, in fact, end up as laborers at the mill. But always with a great deal of envy. I think that's why they would emphasize this, because we ended up being extremely envious of the people that lived in Pine Falls, this small town, manicured lawns, sidewalks. The Hudson's Bay had purchased a company store and moved their store from the reserve to the town in 1937, and so that was big town Canada, and so it was. These were times when young men in the school would talk about turning 16 or whatever, reaching grade 8, at the most grade 9, done with that and off to work. Just like our father had done, who had been in school. So I have a picture of him in 1917 when he was a boy of 14. this little guy, mischievous look on his face, and the priest, Father Gillen, he's a Belgian guy, former officer in the Belgian army with a stern look. And he had quite a reputation for being powerful and fierce with the boys and girls. So that was it, David. The best you could get was to be inspired by your parents with words and actions, demonstrating to us what you might end up being if you didn't get an education. But if you did, right, you could end up like these guys and young women in the town. And so there was little thought of becoming a professional, becoming an owner of.
So why don't you work in the paper mill?
David, I had one experience in the paper mill when I was just out of high school there, and I got fired. I was drunk on the job, and I fell in the river. We worked, a bunch of guys called the slasher. We had pit pole. We had pit poles, and you'd bring in the pine, the spruce, on occasion balsam. And I spent time with a guy that I at one of the local watering holes, and I got really drunk. I came to work drunk. I fell in the river. I don't know how I got out. I figured, geez, Christ, I got to dry up here. I walked over to the lunchroom, which was a bit of a place where you took a break, and I immediately passed out. And the foreman came by, didn't say anything apparently, looked at Fontaine, gave instructions to the foreman, fired this guy on Monday, and I was fired. My very first experience. And maybe it was for my own good, because if I had enjoyed the job, and especially enjoyed the money, I might have made a real effort to stay at the mill. Because the people that worked at the mill drove the cars, had decent clothes, and they had, they could go to the bay. There was no credit there, but there were a whole number of smaller stores, and the mill workers would get credit. And come back in a couple of weeks and pay off. But thank God for my mother. She didn't raise Cain with me for the debacle, because I ended up in Winnipeg. Because I ended up in Winnipeg going to one of these business schools, and picked up a bookkeeping course at 3 levels: beginners, junior, senior, or intermediate. Yeah, and that's what I did, and I became a clerk for a short while, and moved on very quickly to become really quite politically involved with the revival of the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, led by the great Grand Chief David Crushane. Before the Manitoba Indian Brotherhood, there was the Association of Manitoba Chiefs, and they were established to deal with the amendment process that had been introduced by the federal government. We introduced the Indian Act, to amend the Indian Act, I should say, because I don't know if you know this, there's some provisions there that were quite archaic. For example, we couldn't hire lawyers to represent land-related issues from 1927 until 1951-52, when the Indian Act was amended. Women in our community couldn't hold public office until the same time. The potlatch law was in effect, and that was set aside. The Sundance prohibition was set aside, and our late mother was the first woman to be elected to band council in Canada. In June 52, our father had died in a few months before her ascension to her throne as the first woman elected to
How old were you when your dad died?
7. Mother never remarried. Mother never remarried. So some aspects of the residential school were good for us, large family. And interestingly enough, this is an aside there, her father died with life insurance. This Indian guy on the reserve had life insurance, bought life insurance, and he had a brand new 1952 Monarch when he passed on. He was going to set up a business, a taxi business, because there are 2 or 3 taxi businesses in the neighboring towns, and they did good business on the reserve. He said, why not me? And the worst part of it was you had to sell a bunch of our cattle to gather up enough money.
For the car.
Yep, and the Indian agent had to give his approval for the sale of the livestock off reserve. And my dad and I went with my dad, a little boy, sat in the back of this big truck, and they went about identifying his cows, sold them, and this was actually the second Monarch we had had, and we had this brand new Monarch when he passed on. But then when the insurance ran out, David, we became like everybody else, and we struggled.
Just to close off on this section of the conversation about the residential schools. So your grandparents went to residential schools. Your parents went to residential schools. You went to residential schools. There were other generations after you that went to residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
What is the significance of that today? What is the lingering legacy in our country of the residential schools?
If you take it from the community, First Nation community or the Indigenous community, there is still a lot of anger, bitterness, and probably questions of why me? Why did I end up there or there? Why wasn't I given an opportunity to learn my language? Why wasn't I told about the history of not just my community, but of Indians? We're still known as Indians then. Why weren't we told about the history of Indians? And so it was. It is now. I should say, it still remains one of the biggest challenges when we talk about reconciliation and the journey of reconciliation that all Canadians are on, whether they approve of what transpired with the settlement agreement and the monies that had been offered to survivors. Whether we like it or not, we're all part of this journey. And but one of the biggest challenges we still face is how to rid this notion of notions of bitterness and anger and spite, and these all are in the lives and minds of the vast majority of the people that are still alive, and they're fast passing away, David. And but I would be wrong if I suggested that every single former residential school student remains bitter and angry, and they will never forgive, because the apology had to come with forgiveness. And many of the former students moved in that direction, right, to rid themselves of this dark cloud. And many were actually quite successful in that regard, even keeping in mind that they had to shed many, many tears before they could get to that point, men and women. And in my own case, David, to a very large extent, I've moved on with my life. Do I forget? Jeez, I wish I could. I really wish I could, because there are far too many moments in my life where I have these flashbacks, and they can be terrible. I was in therapy for about 5 years in Winnipeg, and that was tough.
Confronting it, you mean? Therapy forced you to confront it.
Oh yes, the every bloody aspect of my experiences, and I was suffered a near breakdown at 39, and then coming from out of that into, and I never talk about that. Obviously, first time I've ever mentioned that I suffered, because I'd gone back to University of Manitoba to pick up my BA, and I had terrible moments. And then I decided to break from the rest of the crowd and decided I was going to do something about this. And so I decided to speak publicly about the residential school experience for the very first time at a Chiefs gathering in Whitehorse, Yukon territory. And I was chastised by a number of leaders there for talking about a matter that wasn't for Chiefs assemblies. You didn't talk about abuse that you suffered in residential school at these very important gatherings. This was an important occasion, and this kind of discussion had no place. And in fact, one of the conversations I had after I'd given my speech, because I was a regional chief, the chief told me, you should have had this guy write your speech for you. You would have done much better. And we kept on talking. I didn't back down, kept on talking. Then at the conclusion of our discussion, I found out he was an abuse victim. And he didn't want his story told in public anywhere. But I knew I was right. I knew I did the right thing. When I was finished, I came off stage, and there's these two women chiefs from east of Kenora who were in tears. And I guess their story, their memories, they had these flashbacks when I was talking. And I knew I'd done the right thing. And I was especially pleased with George Erasmus, who was national chief, who commended me for my talk and said to me, "Look what you've opened up, Phil." But we had no idea what I had opened up, other than the possibility that this story, this Canadian chapter, unknown to most Canadians, would finally come to the surface in the same way that I experienced meeting with most of the former students at the public school. They had a 50-year reunion, and a couple guys I had played hockey with, and I knew them. I went to class with them. They said, "Phil, Christ, we didn't know. We didn't know." He said, "I'm in Gimli at the Air Force Base, and I see you on TV one night. What the heck is going on?" And that was true for far too many. They didn't know. And why should they make an effort to know? Because when we played hockey, we were in our element. We loved it.
Right.
So they didn't see anything on bad, right? How could they? We'd come dressed and back to the school. But that was sadly the fact with too many Canadians about their experience with residential schools.
Phil, if you take children out of their homes and away from their parents for 10 months of the year, over the course of 100 years, what happens to normal family relationships? What happens to parenting skills? What happens to the basic ability to create a functioning family unit?
Well, other than the women, and I refer specifically to women, the men, fathers, had, of course, an obvious role to play, which is make sure there's food on the table. but the women that fiercely defended their women, I mean their children, you were going to get something positive out of that. But the one thing that really was hurtful to my mother, for example, we had it good when my dad worked. He was a millwright, and among other things at the mill. He was a brakeman with the train that came in there, worked in the yard. And our mother wanted to maintain that kind of family life, but it became impossible at a certain point. So we suffered like most families. I mean, we weren't told, hey, you should go to college in Winnipeg, we'll pick up a business school, business course, or go be a nurse's aide. Remember when I was a young guy, David, in up till 1965, 64, we had our own Indian hospital. The doctors, nurses, and the young women from the reserve decided to pack it in with Briscoe, ended up as nurses' aides there. And until we merged with the Pine Falls Hospital, became a public hospital. But the Indian agent still was a significant presence in our lives, and we went through many of them. And so it wasn't unusual. We didn't have an unusual family. We were like anybody else, struggled like hell. And the our mother tried to keep us together. It was difficult. When I turned into my teenage years, I started drinking, and that was probably the single most important extracurricular activity from family life and whatever when I got out of school than drinking. And I became an alcoholic. I quit booze altogether close to 45 years ago. But
you're a boring guy to go to dinner with.
Hey, look, I have so many fun stories, David. You lots of them. Some of them embarrassing, other times. Oh, Christ. And
no, but you don't drink. That's the problem. Now, not to make light of that, obviously. Jumping forward a lot of years, we are having a huge discussion in North America, maybe in the world, but certainly in North America. We're having a huge discussion prompted by the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, by the Minneapolis police. What can you tell us here? Because growing up in Saskatchewan, I've become aware of a lot of stories involving Indigenous people and the police. What can you tell us, who are all focused on the relationship between the Black community and the police in the States, and to some extent in Canada? Talked about it with Selena last week. What is the situation? What is the relation between the police and the Indigenous community in Canada?
It isn't any healthier than the experience in the United States with Black people and Native Americans. But we keep in mind that we're a much smaller country. We have 350 million people in the United States, 15% of which are Black. You have Canada with about 36, 37 million people, and 4% of the population is Indigenous or First Nation. And keeping in mind that for the longest time after treaty, David, we very seldom saw the RCMP on the reserve, because there was an understanding that they were only to come to the reserve for serious crimes that included alcohol, domestic abuse, and murder. So we didn't have many murders. Domestic abuse, well, you didn't want to reach out to the cops, so they'd come in for alcohol. A lot of the guys were bootleggers internally because Indians weren't allowed in the pubs until, in many cases, in the late 60s. And so they did what they had to do to be like what they saw in Pine Falls, because the only guys from the reserve, there were no women's pubs that could go into the pubs, were people that enfranchised. They gave up their Indian status, one, and the returning veterans from the First and Second War, I think, were allowed without giving up their status. And so that was, quite an undertaking to finally be able to do as others did in town. And the Indian Act was still largely in control of our lives. The Indian agent lived in town. You had an office at the post office. And so whenever you needed to do business with the Indian agent, you had to go into town, walk up the stairs of the post office, and he'd have his office there. And that's where he would conduct business. And that was an innovation because we only had, I think, 3 or 4 Indian agents that actually used the office. Most of the time they came from the town of Selkirk to come and pay their monthly visit or for some other occasion. And that's and the Indian Act is still with us, brought into force in 1876, was amended a couple times, large one in 1951. And that process resulted in the politicization of our communities to some extent. I mentioned the Association of Manitoba Chiefs. And believe it or not, one of the great Canadian heroes who is now being touted as the possibility of being on the $5 bill, the late Sergeant Tommy Prince, the great hero, was one of our spokesmen. Okay. And what did he talk about? Getting rid of the Indian Act. Getting rid of the Indian Act. And being
so why isn't it gone? Why isn't it gone?
Well, interestingly enough, I can reference our own efforts in Manitoba with the Framework Agreement Initiative, which was really designed to get rid of the government. We would take over responsibilities that were currently being offered by certain departments to us, First Nations people, and the Indian Act would be repealed. And instead, we would have the reference to the treaties, one, and the spirit and intent of treaties. And so we started this process, and it was absolutely fascinating. We thought we would be the first community in Canada to be outside from, or to be out from underneath the Indian Act, keeping in mind that there was a community in Montreal, the Michael Band, that's made up largely of Mohawks from Montreal, would travel westward with the fur trade and stay. They were completely enfranchised. They were the first. And I don't know if that one was by choice. Ours was going to be by choice by the chiefs of the province. We had some resistance, David. I remember at one meeting, and this is a terrible misconception of the Indian Act held by far too many of our people yet. One woman got up at this assembly and said to me, as Grand Chief, who is going to look after us when the government is gone? I said, we will. That's our responsibility. The Indian Act denies us this responsibility. So, interestingly enough, the greatest resistance to getting rid of the Indian Act still lies with many of our leadership. And I'm involved in a unique project here in Saskatchewan where we might offer the government an opportunity to undertake a unique process to, one, instead of an Indian Act ban, you'd have a treaty ban. And the Indian Act would have no play whatsoever. So the thing about the Indian Act, I think why it causes such consternation at our assemblies, is that the Indian Act actually offers certain protections for our people, but in the main, much of it is about prohibition and denial. And so there's this conflict that exists. And I remember putting it to the floor of one of the assemblies, and some very prominent chiefs said, nope, we don't want to go down that path. The Indian Act represents our interests, and believe it or not, some of them said, too many, they protect the treaties, which is the farthest thing from the truth, obviously. It's a denial of our treaties and our treaty relationship with the federal government. So at some point, it'll have to disappear. And we're going to offer Minister Bennett an opportunity to move in that direction. Otherwise, we continue to live under the Indian Act, which is archaic, discriminatory, racist, and the only kind of its legislation anywhere in the world for a race of people that come under full control of the government. Though I would suggest that Canadian government policy in many situations have moved beyond the constraints of the Indian Act, but without changing the law.
Can you tell me why somebody in 2020 chooses to live on a reserve?
Well, we started moving into the cities and towns here in our country in the 60s. Very slow migration into the cities, largely to do with schools, because we most of the reserve schools were up to grade 8 or 9. And so, you had Brandon, you had Bertle, you had Portage-la Prairie, you had Winnipeg, you had in Kenora area, it's schools. So kids were going into Winnipeg or to these towns and cities to be educated, to be further educated. And so they were followed, or we followed people that had been brave enough to move off the reserve to go live in our case, in Winnipeg and work in Winnipeg. Menial jobs, but work nonetheless. And so that became the journey, the migration into the cities. And so we end up with reserves now in 2020 that are populated by 50% of the total membership list. Most of the other 50% that are off reserve live in cities: Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, and then to the east. And for many, their experience hasn't been any better, indeed worse than their residential school experience if they're residential school survivors. It's been a bloody struggle. But they say life in the city is still better than what's on reserve. But those people that remain on reserve see this as their only connection to the past, the way it was when the treaty relationship was understood in clearer terms than it is understood today. And so it's this very strong, confusing connection to the past, the reserve, and it plays into this fact that too many of our communities I'm talking about treaty nations, treaty people that entered into treaty, and the first one in the number treaties, 1 to 11, 1871, August 3rd with our treaty, lost a lot of their land. So the big struggle now is to get back the land, to acquire the land that rightfully belongs to them through a claims process. That's been 70 years in the making or so, and there hasn't been one government, and there have been successive governments that hasn't been that can be considered. Wow, this is really good. This is a terrific process. And with this government, we've seen some pretty significant settlements where land changes hands. People are able to get some of their land back with the money they get through the settlement. And they become, the settlement monies become economic drivers. Some become the wealthiest communities in different regions of the country.
Yeah.
And it's so why the reserve? I think it's the hope that things will be better at some point. But in the main, I think, David, the people that remain aren't equipped or well equipped enough to make a go of city life or living in town, but mostly city life. And we end up congregating in the core areas of these cities with all of the problems that are manifested by poverty. And look at the violence in my city, in Winnipeg. It's incredible. And it's Indian against Indian, right? They're killing each other. And a lot of it has to do with crystal meth. It's a scourge in our communities. And it's how to deal with that. I don't know. It's a huge problem on my reserve. Huge problem. And we have a large reserve, close to 9,000 people. And if it's true in Saugeen, it's true in many communities in every part of the country. So
there's a lot of people self-medicating their pain away.
Oh, gosh. True. So,
Phil, on the government, just a minute. I don't really want to dwell on politics per se in this, but you have a lot of experience dealing with governments, and you're known as a person that deals with governments in a conciliatory manner. You're not a adversarial fighter. This government, the Trudeau government, came into office creating as high a set of expectations about what they would do for Indigenous people as is possible to create. The Prime Minister said it was his single most important relationship that he had to get right. They promised to fulfill all the recommendations of the UN Commission. They bought all the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And they seem to have devoted a significant amount of money toward this problem. Yet I sensed in the last couple of years a fair bit of disappointment in the First Nations community about the government. What's your sense of how they're doing, and what, if they're doing something wrong, what ought they to be doing differently?
Well, I've been impressed with a number of things. One, the mandate letter speaks to this relationship. I don't know if that's the first time that has been this relationship has been described in these mandate letters in this manner. They've committed significant sums of money. They created this center that used to be the museum, I think, the U.S. museum. So they have their place. I don't know if you can describe it as their center of government. I don't think so, because the center of government for the Assembly of First Nations are reserve chiefs. The national chief has no inherent power. He gets it from chiefs from Canada. So their commitment to recognizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, boil water advisories, getting rid of those, housing, and the child welfare system and the broken child welfare system, which they resisted, by the way, for some considerable time, fighting the court case. And so you have that.
I don't know why anybody bothers to fight Cindy Blackstock. Like, you're just not going to beat that woman. She's too smart, she's too determined, and she's too hardworking.
Fearless.
Yeah.
Dedicated. I absolutely love Christy Blackstock. And so you have this set of principles and different symbolic gestures on how it's going to be different and better. But you have to have a willing partner. You have to have someone that is willing to collaborate with you. And it is on that part of the spectrum where it's been a huge challenge, because all of a sudden you have these possibilities, and our leadership is suddenly faced with questions about what the hell do we do now? And land claims, for example, we talked about that briefly in our conversation, David, is a huge problem. Gosh, so much land that rightfully belongs to our people is still in the hands of people that acquired it either through theft, outright theft, government interference, the abrogation of the treaty of treaties, and the like. And the problem with that, the resolution of this long-standing problem, is that the bureaucracy essentially remains the same, right? And policy quite often doesn't reflect what the politicians are saying. So you end up with a process that is full of delays. I'll give you an example. I was retained by one of the communities in Manitoba, large community, to negotiate their claim. And they had been in negotiations for 25 years with 3 different set of lawyers. They had to borrow thousands upon thousands of dollars to pay for legal fees. The chief came to me and said, look, would you represent us on this claim? And I said, if I have your trust and confidence, I will. And so we took it on, and we in effect concluded this deal in 2 years that had been 25 years in the making, still had not been validated, committing the government to a just and fair compensation package. And we did something completely unique in terms of land claims negotiations. We set up a mediated process. We brought in a mediator, and we have, one of the best, if not the best, Justice Akabuchi as the mediator. And and he walked us through this settlement process. And now we're at the tail end, right? We're done, actually. The community will be receiving a check from the federal government, significant sums of money. And we had support from every major reference point in the government, the PMO, Miller's Shop, Bennett's Shop, and Justice Canada. But it wasn't, initially it wasn't easy. They had never considered doing mediation, right? They were tied in so tightly with the more adversarial tradition approach, which is largely about litigation. And that's not the way to go.
So we've barely scratched the surface of any of this, but we're pretty much out of time. And I wanted to just say to you at the end that, get your reaction to this, that my read of our conversation this morning is that as we talk about the present day and the future, that you're more hopeful than you are angry. You sound to me like you think things can and perhaps even are going in the right direction. Am I reading you right or wrong?
David, we certainly are going in the right direction. But I have a point to make. I believe it's really an important point that ought to be considered by all of us. We watched the protests. We watched the demonstrations with rail blockades, with the most recent one to do with Susan. We learned yesterday about this major victory with the Standing Rock folks in the States, where the court ruled in their favor. My hope is that at some point, my grandchildren will not have to protest and demonstrate to get with what is rightfully theirs. There shouldn't be a situation where we have to bring attention to our issues by protests and demonstrations and blockades. Governments should be willing. They should have the political will to do the right thing. For example, We're in 2020. We should have an Indigenous person at the Supreme Court of Canada. We still don't have one. We have one federal court judge at the federal court level. The thing that gives me hope is that there is a distinct possibility we will have one the next round, and that there will have more at the federal level, indeed at every judicial level in Canada. But what it will need, if that is to come to pass, some bold steps, real bold steps. But the thing that gives me the greatest hope and optimism, and why I feel that we're going in the right direction, and we will come to a place where it is so much better than it is today. One, the number of our people that are getting educated. And that's making a real difference. Who would have thought that 20 years ago we had presidents of universities, chancellors, professors, gold medal winners that are Indigenous? That's the future. And then the other part we should never overlook is business development, wealth creation. The courts have ruled in our favor a whole number of times. What is the number now? The court decisions that have been favorable to the rights and interests of our people. Close to 200. We're on a terrific winning streak. And we have to take advantage of that. The problem we've had is implementation, right? Good decisions. So how are you going to give effect to those decisions? And so large business interests have taken a far healthy approach to dealing with development in First Nation communities and territories. And that's making a difference. But we haven't escaped COVID-19. Some very successful businesses are struggling mightily to stay afloat. So those two together are going to make a huge difference, David. And in fact, they are making a difference. And then the people that have been elected in Parliament, in different provincial legislatures. We have Indigenous people now that are premiers. I'm referring to Nunavut, and we have a whole number. The finance minister in BC is Carol James, Indigenous. Alberta, I don't know. Saskatchewan, I don't know. Winnipeg, the leader of the official opposition is Indigenous, Ojibwe. So you have a whole number of these examples that are inspirational, in fact, and should make a difference to our young people. Now, what we shouldn't impose on our young people, Dave, is day after day stories of sadness and bitterness and recrimination and these memories that they're acquiring should be more positive. That what they see, what they have before them is a better life. And all of what they see around them that I didn't see of success stories will be as inspirational to them as they are to me at my age today. I'm just amazed. We have people in Harvard, you know? That's incredible. Yeah. Even though Harvard was initially established for Native Americans in the 1600s. They're finally moving in the right direction.
Phil, thank you for this. Thank you for your honesty and candor today. Thank you for the openness with which you talk about these things and the constructive way you talk about these things. Thanks for everything you've done to make the country a better place. And thanks for your friendship over the years. It's really meant a lot to me.
David, it's been a real honor. When you asked me, I said, I'd love to do the show because I've heard of this podcast, one of the most popular ones now. And I knew that you and I would have a good conversation. It would be candid, above board, and there's really no reason to hide anything. We've known each other for such a long time. And you've always been a terrific friend. You've been, I know that you work behind the scenes incredibly hard to get a settlement agreement, the apology, and what flowed from their TRC. People overlook the fact, and for whatever reason, that it really happened during Martin the Right Honorable Martin. That's where it happened. And you were a large part of Martin's office. Thank you.
Well, thanks for giving him some credit. It was the first subject he ever talked to me about in politics. So
he's been consistent.
Yeah. Phil, great to talk to you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. Gosh, it's been one of the best mornings I've had for a long time. I tell you, quite honestly.
All right. Give my love to Kathleen, please.
I will do. Thank you.
Thanks. If we have learned anything over these past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. The only way to get the detailed, boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Jenni, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Jenni, yesterday was your birthday.
It was, yes. Don't ask me how old I am.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jenni. Happy birthday to you.
Aw, you are so sweet. You're making me laugh.
Oh my God. Are you back in Fenelon?
No, I'm back in the city, but I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna head back next week.
Okay. What are you doing in the city? What brought you in?
Work. I actually have some in-person meetings this week, so.
Oh, okay. In-person meetings are back? Shit.
Starting to come back.
Oh,
sorry.
No. That's going to be the end. That's going to be the end of my sojourn up here at the cottage if people start expecting me to show up.
Yeah.
Hey, Bob Reid got appointed to the UN yesterday. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess is it a he and Jean Charest did do the tour of going around to dictators and other countries selling our soul to try to win the thing. So I guess this either means Blanchard is being punished, or maybe the long-standing rumor that the Liberals are bringing him in to go into the PMO will end up holding true.
Yeah, that's all possible, and I found it kind of interesting that they gave Bob such a plum posting, because I don't think that the relationship between Trudeau and Ray was very good when they were together in Parliament, and especially after Trudeau became leader, I think that Bob kind of stepped out on them abruptly, so maybe that's why it took so long for him to get some kind of major appointment. But
my guess is he's got a good relationship with Freeland, which she was probably the person that was driving the bus on this.
Yeah, probably. He did a nice handoff to her in the riding and all that.
Yeah.
So, anyway, he'll be good at it, right? I mean, to the extent that we've talked about the UN and to the extent that it matters one way or another, but he'll be good at that job, right?
Yeah, he's a career politician. He will be good at the function of it. I don't think it's gonna change Canada's standing one way or another. Like, I don't think Bob Ray is gonna go in there and light the world on fire. Let's put it that way.
There you go. Maybe we'll just leave it at that. Hey, so something minor happened in politics over the course of the last week, and that's this We contract business.
Well, I don't think it's really minor. I think it's pretty major for the Liberals.
Right. Well, they nipped it in the bud. It's over, right? I haven't seen any coverage of it yesterday.
There was no new coverage, but I think, this is a prime minister who's now being investigated for the fifth or sixth time for an ethics breach. And so I think this is big. This is the first showing in our post-COVID world of the media actually glomming onto something, and they actually had to and the Liberals had to backtrack, which is something they haven't done. Regardless of the criticism they've received on things, Trudeau very rarely does that. And so I think they knew it was bad enough, which makes me think there is a lot more to this story than we know, because they, it was a pretty quick backtrack. It was 3 days. They probably could have helped themselves if they did it on day one. But I think there is a lot more to the story, and I don't think the media and I don't think the opposition should. Should let it go. This is ultimately why having Parliament sit would be a very good thing right now, because we're not talking about a small program, David. We're talking about a $900 million, like a $1 billion program.
What do you think might be more to it? What do you think might be what might there more be to find?
Who knows? But obviously, we has been making money off of the government in other ways, because it's now come up. They've had different contracts, what have you. I'm sure it's more than the 3 or 4 that the media have been reporting. And it's obvious that the Kielburgers have a very strong personal relationship with the Prime Minister. So I think there is more to this. I think it would be very interesting to see how much government money we has received in the last 4.5 years.
Why do you think, so we're, both political practitioners from time to time, and if somebody brought this fact situation to us and said, we're proposing to do this, you would say, crazy. Don't do that. You're going to get hammered and you're going to end up withdrawing it.
Yes.
So why do you think they did it in the first place?
I don't know. Well, I think there is a sense among the Prime Minister, like he's been able to get away with things without a lot of scrutiny in the past, and also if you look at, in terms of the ethics investigation, if we go back to the first one, the free trip to the Aga Khan's private island, there wasn't a lot of scrutiny on that. If you look at other things that Conservatives went through or other parties went through, it was not the same. And so I think there's a little bit that he feels that he is untouchable on some of this stuff, and it's becoming he's not anymore. I think for this one, this is the first real chink in the armor where he's not untouchable. So I think it's going to be interesting. I hope the opposition, the media keep on it, because I just think there is definitely more to this.
I think it's my observation that every government has some blind spots around friends or relationships that they have that allows them to get into ethical trouble. They either don't see the relationships the same way outsiders see them, or they trust and believe in the people so much. And yes, listeners, I do understand the irony of what I'm saying right now. But because in my case, I might have been one of the blind spots that Paul Martin had. But everybody has them, it seems to me, and this seemed to be one of those things too, where maybe they're just so convinced of the virtue of the Kielburgers and of this organization that they didn't think it would be criticized.
Well, I guess it's possible. That's very rose-colored and naive. I'm not sure that's the case. I don't think Trudeau falls in the category of being that loyal of a boss. I actually think there's a lot of politicians that don't have blinds, that don't and are willing to throw people under the bus. And we could do a whole podcast probably too on different stories of things we've gone through or people we know that have gone through. I don't think it's that. I think they truly thought that they could get away with this. And frankly, the whole program, if you want to even just get into it on that, is lunacy. You're talking about a paid volunteer program. What does that So it makes no sense. And so
it's a job with shitty pay, right?
Yeah,
it's a job with shitty pay, is what it is.
and then the Kielburgers were the ones that were going to be able to, the We program, to decide which charities were going to be accepted. So there was so much stink from the top on all of these decisions being made. I can't believe that someone wasn't sitting at the cabinet table or sitting around, in the boardroom at 228 Langevin, the Prime Minister's office now, and saying, guys, this seems really like a bad idea. I think this is going to come back and bite us in the ass on a whole host of things.
It can't have gone to cabinet or that would have happened. It must have been a walk around, eh?
A $1 billion walk around? They're running the government a lot.
Hey, a billion's not what it used to be. A billion's not what it
we won't even know how many billions. We can get into this snapshot thing they're going to release. We're not even going to know how many of the billions of dollars they've been spending.
So just to finish up on the Kielburgers, then the government cancels the contract, tries to pay no attention to this. This thing's over. Nothing to look at over here. What can the Conservatives do to keep this issue alive?
Well, I think that if I'm an opposition party now, there's going to be a lot of ATIPs filed, although that will take time. The ATIP system moves slow under us. It's moving even slower under the Liberals, and with most of government not being back to work or working, most of the government working remotely, I think it's probably even slower, because ATIP, of course, are giant mounds of paper. But I think that both them and the media should continue to ask questions about what further relationships the Kielburgers and the We Foundation have had with and subsidiaries of We, because there's several. It started with, I think it was Feed the Children, which is being investigated in Kenya, by the way, for corruption. So I think that the government and the media, or the opposition and the media, should continue that.
Okay. All right. Happier news. I'm puzzled by Leslyn Lewis's fundraising totals.
She had a great quarter.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Like, you and I both know how difficult it is to raise money in leadership campaigns, right? Especially when you're not in government, right? Especially when you're not in government. And that's a big number, like $1 million. I wouldn't have suspected she would have raised $1 million total. Yeah.
No, it is to raise $1 million in this political climate. People are. I'm actually surprised that fundraising numbers for all the candidates were as high as what they were, and that people are willing to or able to give money still. But what's also more telling is she also had the most donors. I think she had like 9,000.
Almost 10,000, 9,300 donors or something. Yeah.
So I think it shows that there is and we've talked about this before, there is a portion of the party that is unhappy with the two perceived front runners, and I think it's obvious by these numbers that they're willing to kind of they're willing to kind of look at a third option. So good for her. I think it's great.
Is there any scenario? No, because it's not a delegated convention, right? Because in a delegated convention, if she was, say, surprisingly close to second, right, then there could be some weird thing happen in a convention that results in, Stéphane Dion being selected, because delegated conventions could generate those kind of results. But there's no real, people are going to vote and they're going to rank order it. That's how they do it, right? Yeah.
And so
the convention dynamic is completely irrelevant. The dynamic of the balloting is completely irrelevant.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of people that think that automatic, everyone that's voting for one candidate, the speculation, all the SoCons of who are going to vote for Leslyn Lewis or Derek Sloan are going to 100% go to Aaron and what have you. And it's just, there's no evidence that that's the case. And and I don't think we'll see that. I think you'll see some people that vote for Leslyn will will not vote for will not vote further down, because you can vote for as little as one person, and if your candidate drops off, your ballot drops off. And some people will vote for Aaron, and some people will vote for Peter. I don't think there's going to be much influence on second ballot support by the other campaigns. It's just it's not the nature of this leadership race, of how we do it.
Is your sense, does Sloan have anything going on whatsoever?
Well, I think he's definitely in fourth. We'll see. If you remember, and I know we talked about this, Brad Trost did surprisingly well. He was high up in the last leadership race, higher up in the ballots, and he did surprisingly well in different ridings in Scarborough and Montreal, for example. So if Derek Sloan has been, because Brad's supporting him. So if Derek Sloan has those lists and those people feel as compelled to sign up and vote as what they did under Brad, then he may do surprisingly well. But it's going to be a different dynamic. We had 14 people on the stage last time. This is going to only go to like a ballot or two. It'll definitely go to a second. I'd be surprised if it went to a third.
Right, because. Well, so you think, wait a second, so that means when Sloan drops off, that his
a third
votes will be enough to put McKay over the top?
Probably not, no. Right,
so it's probably a third ballot when Lewis drops off, presumably.
Possible. It's possible.
Right.
So we'll see. That's the thing. It's this more is, so the campaigns, I'm assuming now, are all doing they're all doing some form of voter ID to find out like where their opposition IDing the non-supporters to see where they're going, so they have a snapshot of that.
Right, and then we'll get the spin. We'll get the respective spin from all the camps.
Exactly. It's they're all spinning now, and I just kind of laugh and say, please don't spin me. Hey guys, I've been in your position. Don't spin.
Holy shit!
Hey!
Holy shit!
I'm here.
Well, nice of you to show up.
Well,
exactly.
Hey, Jenny, happy birthday!
Thank you.
Oh, I'm screwed up my mic now.
We were just talking about the powerhouse fundraising numbers of Leslyn Lewis.
I'm just fiddling with my my stuff. So my house is overrun by repairmen. We got like 5 consecutive days of 35-degree heat here, and my furnace and air conditioner conked. So that's awesome. So that's and I'm a fat middle-aged man, and that makes me extremely sensitive to temperature. So this has been a cause for distress.
I just imagine you sitting around in a towel all day or something.
I can't bother with the towel, man. The towels. No good. No. I dropped the towel on day 2, man. It's I'm just standing in front of the fridge with the door open, breathing heavily, and it sort of suck whatever cool I can off of the strawberries. Does this Llewellyn thing matter? Like Leslie, what does those numbers matter a damn? They don't, do they? Other than to show that the conservatives, anybody in the Conservative Party can raise money, and it's got to be weirdly discouraging if you're not a conservative. Like, how can they raise that much money for kind of an also-ran candidate in the middle of all this?
Well, I think all the people who ran for the Liberal leadership in 2006 are still paying off their fucking debts from that goddamn thing. Like everybody just spends and then spends the rest of their life paying off their leadership debt.
Well, I think actually Elections Canada let Hedy Fry and your buddy Ken Dryden off from having to pay back their debt. But I digress.
Did they?
I think so.
I thought I think they have to work on weekends at like a Denny's or something. I think there's like some kind of public service. I think that's true though. I think if you go to Vancouver, you'll find Hetty Fry is like collecting pop bottles in the ditch or something. She's like, until Elections Canada takes their boot off my throat, this is the way it goes, right? But anyway, it's goofy.
No, Scott, I think it matters because what we were saying earlier, I think it shows that there is a large number of people within the Conservative Party that aren't really happy with the perceived top two options. And it also matters because the more money you have, the more you can spend it on ID and GOTV. So her campaign manager, I mentioned before, Steve Outhouse, good guy, obviously running a great campaign. He's able now he's got options in front of him that having, $1 million raised in the last quarter, he wouldn't have had before. So it means, potentially direct mail. It means phone calls. So I think it's when the world opens up a little bit more, travel. Some of the candidates are starting to travel now. So I actually think it absolutely does matter. It will mean she does better than what she would without it.
I buy that. But unless you're a bare-fanged bigot and you love Sloan, basically she's the only interesting thing in this race. It hasn't been a super, like now they're pretty known commodities. So I can see why people might go, I don't know, if I'm going to cut $100 check, unless I want to be with, in the winner's camp, I guess I'll throw it her way. She's the only kind of other interesting option, right?
Yes, very much. She's an alternative. She's an interesting option. I've said before, I have had a lot of people who told me, 3 months ago they were voting for Aaron or voting for Peter that said they're going to vote for her on the first ballot.
That is, to me, that's an iceberg thing. Like, to me, you see 10,000 people giving $1 million in a quarter to a candidate, and that candidate has something going on. You may not be able to see it. It may not be obvious or visible to you, but somewhere on the ground, something's going on for that person.
It's got to be troubling to O'Toole, doesn't it? I mean, like, you got such an established front runner in this race, and I know O'Toole's had success raising money, so I guess it doesn't have to come at his expense. But
he was the top. He raised the most. He raised the most in the last quarter.
Right. So I mean, good for him then. But still, to the degree to which there's any buzz in the race, it isn't centered around him, right? I think he's been thought of as having run like a nice, disciplined second place race that is not going to get him to first place. And degree to which there's a discussion around anything or anyone else, it's not him. And that's just got to be dispiriting. It's kind of like what you go through a lot of the time, David. This often happens to you.
And I'm
people are
often
overlooking
dispirited by it. Dispiriting is my sort of default mood.
Yeah, no.
I don't think so. Listen, remember campaigns. You are so submersed in it. You think everyone thinks their campaign is going better than what it's going, and everyone thinks you have the momentum. And the only people you really talk to are the same people in your campaign team, and they think things are going awesome as well. So my guess is none of the candidates are dispirited because they're all drinking their own bathwater, which is expected at this point in the campaign.
And they're drinking beer.
What you need is a campaign
night. Like 11 o'clock at night, they're like sitting on Zoom drinking beer and saying, it's the Coptic Christians. You're not thinking about it. The Coptic Christians are coming out for us in huge numbers. Fucking people aren't tracking it. They don't know. We're subterranean, but the Coptic Christians are going to crash through and give us the win.
Need a campaign manager like me that wears their latest tracking results on their face all over the place. I don't think there's anybody in the Win campaign that thought we were winning the election based on the leadership that they were getting from me. So
David won't be coming to the meeting this morning. He's covered in tobacco and remorse.
I actually had a Go
ahead, do it.
No, I was going to say I'm opposite. I actually had a pretty good poker face. I would never lie, but I could get by with letting on things were a lot better than what they were.
David and I are the exact opposite.
I've literally been caught weeping.
We'll happily lie, but we can't hide a single thing. It's like, oh my God, he's drinking lemon gin and laying on his back. He's like, things are great. I see a big turnaround of the GTA, and anyhow, just give me a couple minutes, please. My shows are about to come on.
Doug Finley could convince you of anything. Like during the Perth Middlesex by-election, and that was when Gary Schellenberger and the PCs won, and I lived down there for like 3 months. And I'm sure every number we had was awful. And I was too young, like I was too green to really to fully see it. And he had everyone convinced we were winning. Like, oh, Jenni, the numbers are good. The idea is good. And then basically election night, just before the polls closed, he's like, yeah, he goes, if we get our 15% back and get our deposit, I'm going to be happy. And I was like, what? You're not doing well.
So unfortunately, we're recording this on a Tuesday morning, so we're one day out of sync with Morneau's financial snapshot, which comes out tomorrow morning. Any recent news on this? What are we expecting, Scott? We know you're wired into these people.
Oh yeah, no, they most of their decision making actually comes from the basement here. They don't make a move without consulting. I have no idea what to expect, and we've talked about it before. I don't get the concept of a fiscal snapshot by signaling to people that you're hesitant and you're going to do something less than a full update and a full narrative. I think you give yourself the worst of all possible worlds. I think that you rob yourself of providing that narrative and shaping that narrative, but you're still stuck with numbers. So like, I don't know, like I'm guessing they're going to say, due to the unpredictability of things going forward, we're going to give you a hot, medium, and cold scenario, like kind of a Goldilocks snapshot, and so here's kind of like if things turn around, this is what it is. If things go really into the shitter, here's where it's at. We kind of chug along, here's where it's at. And so people, to my mind, what that robs you of is, or the challenge with that, and it may be a truthful characterization. It may be that there's lots of unpredictability, in which case I would say, sorry, we're going to do it in September, not now. But what the challenge that it creates is then people are still going to report those numbers. And I'll share a secret with you. The media will report the worst set of numbers. Okay, so that's the story. Okay, the story is going to be the most pessimistic storyline. And right. So I think what you'll see is that, and I didn't think this earlier, but I think you'll see the government say something with respect to CERB or a new program. I have no inside track, and there's been no hint of this, but it just seems to me that if your core project in a fiscal update-like instrument is to lay out the track, and you can't do that, and you can't tell a coherent story, well, then you've got to distract the news. You've got to do something else. And so I think that they'll maybe talk about what's the path forward for the CERB, and Pierre Poilievre and others have talked about that. I just think maybe you've got to do something that's a measure in order to eclipse the news cycle. Because if you're left with just like, we've got 3, 4, maybe 37 scenarios here, and we're not going to attach ourselves heavily to any one of them, you end up with a kind of an incoherent storyline that inevitably will be over-reported on the worst case scenario. So, that...
Can they actually get by? Like, and also, are they going to announce, like, are they going to actually release full current debt numbers? Like,
they got it, don't you think? Under those scenarios, right? We say if it goes really shitty, we have to do this and we have to do that.
But if they don't, like, this is the problem. If it is only talking about like the extension of the CERB or what the CERB program or any of these what we would call temporary type programs, there has to be a more forward-looking plan in terms of the economy in 6 months. The OECD released numbers, and we have the fourth highest unemployment in the world. We're behind Colombia, Spain, and Greece. And so I don't see how the government, like, if it's going to be very disappointing and actually very scary if all Morneau is going to go out tomorrow and say is, okay, well, in 6 months, we're going to, this is the future of the CERB, or this is the future of the wage subsidy, because I think we're headed for a very challenging part of the economy. And I don't think people fully realize. I think, as you know, we keep talking about the new normal, and I fucking hate that term. But I think as if you're the Bank of Montreal and you have 30 floors at First Canadian Place, in this new climate, do you need 30 floors at First Canadian Place? And so when you start to give up real estate, you're thinking, okay, well, maybe we can just restructure generally. And so I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. I think the economy is going to take a huge hit. I think there's going to be massive job losses in private sector in the next 6 months. And I just don't think the Canadian government coming out and telling us that there's an extension to the CERB is going to cut it.
Sorry, just to be clear, and I'll just be fast. That's not what I think is going to happen. I don't think you can get away without putting out a fiscal set of projections, including deficit and debt numbers, and I think that will happen. I just think they'll not commit to it. I think they'll say, here are 2 or 3 scenarios based on possible outcomes, based on possible recovery scenarios, and they'll not commit. So I think you'll have numbers, but this is my point: is I think you'll have numbers, but those numbers, they won't fully attach themselves to it, and possibly they can't. So as a consequence, the worst set of numbers are going to get overwhelmingly reported. And I think to try to counterbalance that, they'll say something that's got news value, so they're not just left with those numbers. But I agree with you that the outlook is challenging. I'm not sure I agree with you that I would choose this moment to try to outline a plan to deal with it, because I'm not sure you do know enough to figure out what a fully forward-looking plan would be.
Well, why would we? I've got an idea to put to you. Why would we assume that all of the intelligence we need in an unprecedented situation like this is housed in the Department of Finance? Why wouldn't they crowdsource solutions? Why wouldn't they be 100% completely transparent about all the metrics they have, the data that they have about the economy? Why wouldn't they be completely transparent about various sensitivities? If this happens, this is the impact on revenue. If this happens, this is the impact on spending. Put that all out there and let the Bosenkools and the Milligans and the Stanfords and everybody have all that data to chew over, and maybe some sort of consensus starts to emerge in the economic world about where we're at and what we ought to do.
Well, Milligan's been hired by the government, has he not?
Well, that's true. That's right. So he'll get the data, but
maybe
maybe the historically collaborative relationship between PCO and finance.
But maybe they will do a version of that, David. I just I don't know that you can be quite that open source in terms of saying to people, here's the guidance we offer you, which is a list of 67 variables. I think they'll have to shape it a little bit more if they end up doing a couple or 2 or 3 or 4 scenarios, but and be transparent and saying, here are the big question marks that rob us of the capacity to give you the certainty you're looking for right now. But I mean, ultimately, though, the government has to tell a story about how it thematically, philosophically, broadly wants to tackle things. So, for example, I think one theme that you could go forward with is saying, what's the role of government in a situation that's as uncertain as this and as treacherous as this? And so one thing is that we have to ensure some measure of fairness, because we know as we go through this reopening, we know as we go through all the perversities that will occur, they're going to affect people in an unequal way. And so one of the things we're going to be vigilant for is making certain that we try to equalize at least the ability of people to participate in some kind of recovery. We think that's wise. We think that's decent. We also think that's economically sound.
But what does that mean?
Well, it probably means some of the stuff we've talked about before, doing direct transfers to help provincial governments and local governments with respect to childcare. It means using fiscal instruments and transfers to encourage school openings in a way that, they support. We're going to need physical expansion for school openings, as you yourself talked about last week, I think, Jenni. So, you talk about those kinds of things. But then there's other things about, taking a look at those that must be forced out into the front lines. What can we do more to help them? How do we protect seniors? So I think there's a variety of things you could muse about, start to think about. But one of the roles surely is to say, in a world with so much uncertainty where people are going to be so obviously unequally impacted, one of our jobs is to help with that. What about cities? Cities can't run deficits. In Toronto, they're starting to talk about the fact they're going to have to cut services, and they are. They're going to have to. So what about federal transfers for that? And saying, this is a place where we're going to swell our balance sheet, then that's something we're going to do, because 80% of people live in cities, and we just can't create a situation where the large populations that depend on those programs and services find that they're denied. That's going to make a bad thing worse. So, I think there's a role for government there. I'm not sure we'll hear that narrative, but that might be one approach. It'd probably be one if I was holding a pen.
But governments also have to look at them. Like, governments are going to have to look at themselves. We have, like, if we look here, both here in Toronto, in Ontario government and the federal government, the government was bloated and overspending prior to COVID, and so governments are going to have to start.
That is not true in Ontario.
The lowest cost per capita of spending.
Lowest spending government in Canada.
Oh my God!
It's a fact.
Okay, and so governments are going to have to start, like John Tory. I'm sure there are measures that he could do. He's going to have to make the decision. It can't just be going to Justin Trudeau and saying, I need more money, or going to Doug Ford. Governments have to make the choice. They're going to have to raise taxes, which I obviously don't support, or they're going to have to cut certain programs. And those are the tough decisions, but it just can't be
those aren't the only choices. Those aren't the only choices, and I would argue those aren't the choices that governments are going to make. And I know you won't like this, but the obvious choice is to go deeper into debt and then come up with debt management strategies, because you can't raise taxes without massively stalling economic recovery hopes, and you can't cut services without doing the same. And so I think you obviously have to have a program structure where you say these are the kinds of values that will guide where we do and where we don't invest. And yes, we're going to try to find value for money, but we all know that lots of eggs are going to get broken making that omelet. But I hope every conservative in the country, frankly, thinks what you think. Because if conservatives start arguing in anything close to an electoral cycle that austerity is the way out of this, they're going to get pounded like a roofing nail.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that what I am saying, I'm actually defending the federal government on this one. When Trudeau says, I've offered you guys $14 billion and I'm not giving you more, because at the end of the day, if Trudeau he decides to give more money to the provinces and to the cities, he's the one that the federal government is going to have to raise taxes. The federal government is the one that has to make the decisions. So I actually think it's very fair for Trudeau to say, no, we're not going to only be the ones that are going to make these decisions. John Tory and Doug Ford, you have to do that as well.
Where would a $14 billion Where would a $14 billion figure come from, by the way? Like, this is to get back to the economic statement or the snapshot or whatever. What anchors their decision making? Like, $14 billion doesn't seem like it's pulled out of the air. It seems like it's not 15, it's not 10, it's not around, it's 14. So it doesn't seem like it was pulled out of the air, but I think it was pulled out of the air in the sense of what is it? Why wasn't it 20 and why wasn't it 10? What was, like, where are they coming up with these ideas? If you don't know what you can afford, how do you say it's 14? Not if the provinces push back and say we need 21. On what basis do you say no?
Well, if it's not based on
the basis has always been that's not our budgetary framework. We can't afford that. In the absence of that, how do you know?
Then you make the decision based on some calculation of need. The challenge is that it's not very transparent what's gone into that formula. So as you say, like if it's not guided by fiscal capacity, because if you say right now in the current context, we can't afford to make decisions based on that because we decide to do nothing at all and we can't afford to do nothing at all, then it's based on presumably some calculation of need. Well, here are priorities, and we've stacked them up on the table, and we found that when we totaled it, it came up to $14 billion. But we don't know what the inputs into that calculation of need are. They haven't been terribly transparent. And so we don't know how much of that is an assumed transfer for childcare stuff, as an example, to enable opening up, or other factors. And so I think, that's something in a proper fiscal update where you could start again to shape that narrative and say, these are the things as a federal government we're willing to do. We're willing to absorb some of your shitty balance sheet. We're going to take over some of your debt because we can borrow at a more manageable level. So we're going to free up that fiscal capacity. But in exchange, provinces and cities, provinces, you're going to have to then spend in certain areas. And then the provinces say, well, hey, fuck off. We'll take the blank check, but we're not going to actually adhere to any rules. So those conversations, they're going to happen because eventually the federal government is going to have to open up purse strings beyond the $14 billion. And the provinces are going to have to agree to some kind of at least an opt-in framework whereby they say, okay, we'll at least agree to these general priorities. And I favor that brand of federalism. To date, Trudeau has not gone near there, but he's going to have to.
Texas has 1,300 cases, positive tests in childcare facilities over the past 2 weeks. 850 staff members, 450 kids.
Yeah.
What does that tell you about the fall for us here in Ontario?
I think this is.
Sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Scott.
No, I'll be really quick. It scares me as a parent, right? And it doesn't scare me. Like I assume, by the way, I can't make this assumption, but I assume that won't hurt the health of my children because I assume that, they're not as heavily impacted, although who knows, maybe that isn't a safe assumption. But it scares me because as we sit here and others sit in similar places and pound the table and say childcare and school reopenings are critical to making this work for reasons that are all valid, there is less discussed the concern about, well, then what happens if you get a series of infections going through there? And we go back to it. Kids have parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and so do those teachers, and so do those childcare service workers. So, you worry about it. We're gonna have to manage and balance and fight our way mask by mask and protocol by protocol, I suspect.
Yeah, listen, I don't disagree. I think this is. I'm not a parent, but having spoken to my friends that are, it really is challenging. They echo Scott's concerns. They're very concerned about their kids going back to school, but they've also balanced it with the things we have talked about, the fact that people need to go back to work full time, and the e-learning is not working, and their kids' mental health are being affected. I've talked to people who said their kids who were doing very well have retreated. They're like shells, like they're in a shell because they have no human interaction. And these are the stuff that governments need to be working on and figuring it out. But I have not spoken to one parent who doesn't want their kids to go back to school for a whole host of reasons. And I think this is where they expect when we see governments out every day communicating, this is one issue they actually want to see governments working on. I think in terms of priority level for parents, I think the back to school schedule is I think the top.
I'm looking at some fresh polling data. That tells me that Canadians remain significantly more scared of COVID, either a second wave recurrence or actually getting it, than they are about any potential economic consequences of a shutdown. So that looks to me like that is still the political driver, is keep us safe from COVID, not do what you need to open the economy.
Yeah, I agree with that. I saw the polling data too. But this is the challenge that I think governments, and this is the challenge people are going to have. It's been for 4 months, it has, like, the world has changed. We can just talk Canada, it has changed. But for the most part, out of all the stuff we've talked about, where I have stood, and I've basically stood on that point since March. I think, though, people, it is going to be, I think the economic consequences of COVID are going to hit, as I said, in the fall. I think as businesses and corporations restructure, big ones, I think people right now who are working from home and making six figures could find themselves in a position where they get restructured out of their company. So for them right now, that is truly how they feel. But if they thought that the economic outcome of this was going to be they don't have a job in 6 months, I think it would be much different. So I think people have a false sense of security on the economic side, which is driving what they're saying. Governments hide behind that and prevent them from having truly a plan forward. And I say that for all levels of government. Like, we'll see what Morneau says
the
tomorrow.
Truth is, Jenny, we are headed toward a deep recession, right?
Yes, I truly believe so.
Oh, most economists are starting to use the D word. Most are saying really we're looking at a genuine depression, which is terrifying. And I agree with everything that Jenny just said. I'm also pessimistic. I'm pessimistic by nature and by analysis. But I don't think that means that people's anxiety about the health challenge will diminish. I think it's going to end up in an even worse stew come October and November. And you talk about mental health and anxiety issues, I think they're going to explode, because I think you are going to see a lot of businesses that have withheld making fundamental structural decisions are going to say, I can't delay them any longer. It's time to start cutting back. I'm going to diminish my workforce. I'm going to diminish my cost structure. I'm going to do what I can to buy myself as much flexibility fiscally going forward. Businesses will make that decision. People will lose jobs, they'll lose income, they'll become income insecure, and they're still going to be feeling anxious about their kids and their parents. And God help us if there's a second wave or an intensification of infection, then all of that's going to compound itself into a place where people are going to be some fucking scared. And and it's a happy note to end on, but
well,
I don't think that's unrealistic.
No, well, we're seeing an economy that doesn't feel that bad because it's been supported by $250 billion of government money over a 4-month period.
Yeah.
So, yeah, right? The economy's kind of still been kept up in the air, and most people have been kept up in the air, but obviously that's unsustainable financially. So when that's all withdrawn, that's when the economic pain is going to come.
I keep coming back to this. I know it sounds crazy, but can't it be made sustainable? And I go back to it in this sense. Can't we start to look as governments, as central banks and governments among a widespread set of developed economies and say, you know what, guys, our debt payment relations, we're going to have to figure this all out. Let's move to 100-year bonds, maybe 150-year bonds. Let's start to amortize our debt out. We're all going to be swimming in debt, and maybe we're not going to be able to stop spending. So let's make certain that we take our boot off of each other's throat. Let's create new relations, new structures. Let's space this pain out. It doesn't make it go away. It's not a magic wand, but it's relieving. And I for the life of me, I don't understand why there hasn't been more discussion about what can be happening at a transnational level among major developed economies to try to relieve that sovereign debt problem. Because we may have to spend, because for the reasons we're talking about. You don't get out of a depression by freezing up.
Well, but this goes to the point we're saying, like, whether I agree with what you're saying or not, I would hope and I want governments to have these conversations, and they're not happening, like, it seemingly anywhere.
Because of Trump and Saudi Arabia is my view. And China.
Oh my God.
No, but seriously, no, that's why. Because you can't enact the IMF and World Bank. You can't enact the G20 because, Saudis are the chair of the G20, and that makes it politically a mess. China is such an overwhelming character, and Trump, of course, is a unilateralist. And so you end up with, you combine those factors, no one can call a fucking meeting that matters. On that happy note, I'm going to have to go. Sorry.
I was going to say, before this is over, every government's going to be defeated that's in office during this period. Everybody will lose. So that's good news for Peter MacKay. Presumably. We do have to go because we've passed our deadline. I did not get a chance to talk about how when I was growing up, there was no more consensus heroic figure in the world that I was aware of than Winston Churchill, and he's about to get canceled. So that and Facebook will have to park for next week when we come back. Jenny, happy birthday. Thank you for being prompt, unlike Reid.
Thank you.
Sorry. I think the air is on, so there's some relief. Happy birthday, Jenny.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody. Subscribe to our podcast. It'll make iTunes very, very happy if you click subscribe next to this podcast. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Bye.